Welcome to the Sage Women podcast, hosted by Melanie White and Dr. Nick Engera. We have real conversations with real women, health professionals, and coaches who share stories about perimenopause, menopause, and a range of women's health issues. Please subscribe so you get the latest updates every fortnight.
It's Melanie White here on the Sage Women podcast, and I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Sarah McKay. Sarah, welcome and thanks for being here today.
Oh, thanks for the invitation to chat.
I'm really excited because you're doing very important work, and maybe you could start by giving us a little bit of backstory about who you are and what you do.
Oh, it's always very self-indulgent to get to talk a little bit about yourself and your work. So my trade is in neuroscience. So I have a PhD in neuroscience and spent a number of years working as a neuroscience researcher in medical research, looking at brain plasticity, so how the brain changes and is shaped during the course of development. And I also worked for a while looking at spinal cord injury research. About 15 years ago, I reluctantly left academia, which I did love. I really loved bench research, but I wanted to set up my own business as a science communicator. So I did that, really specializing in all things brain. So now I like to say I explain the brain. So I've written a couple of books, popular science books for everyone, on women's brain health, one kind of a women's brain health from womb to tomb, and another looking specifically at the neurobiology of pregnancy and motherhood. And I also teach a number of professional development training programs in applied neuroscience and brain health, and just generally speak and share my love of all things neuroscience.
That's amazing. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about your books and your courses a bit later in this episode. But why brains? Like, what got you interested in neuroplasticity?
Oh, well, I've got a little prop here. So when I was in a first year psychology lecture back in 1993, so 30 years ago now, the lecturer recommended we read this book. And anyone who's read this book or come across this book, it's called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Oliver Sacks, will know why I became interested in the brain. It's kind of a bit of a Gen X sort of classic now. Oliver Sacks was a neurologist who wrote these amazing case studies about all of the curious things that went wrong with his patients when things went wrong with their brains. And the man who mistook his wife for a hat used to mistake everyday objects for other objects, and in this instance thought his wife as a hat. Anyway, I was in a Psych 101 lecture 30 years ago, and we were told about this book. And so I went and got the book and was just like, get out, this stuff is fascinating. And the same sort of series of lectures in Psych 101, this was at Canterbury University in 1993 in Christchurch, New Zealand. We also learned about synapses, and I'd never come across a synapse before, the connections between two neurons in the brain. And I just thought it was the most fascinating thing I had ever heard. So I changed universities to Otago University in Dunedin in New Zealand, where they had just started a degree program in neuroscience that year. And so that was 30 years ago, and I just thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever heard about. And 30 years later, I still think, like, even today, I saw a newly published paper that came out looking at the UK Biobank, which is this consortium of about 40,000 people's brain scans, which have just been published for open access, well, I mean, for scientists to kind of analyze. And I was like, get out, this is so cool. So, you know, that love and fascination and just the ability to be curious, because there's always something new to learn and discover, is kind of what's sort of just kept me on that course ever since, whether it's been within, you know, education, research, science communications, writing, speaking, anything brain is just pretty cool.
Your face really lights up when you talk about it.
Yeah, who's lucky enough to figure that out, you know, in their first year of uni and have it carry them through?
Hardly anybody. Yeah, when I went to uni, a bit of first years dropped out because they realised that they were in the wrong course. It's really interesting that you found something that was so exciting. And I heard you mention curiosity. It must be a key part of really wanting to understand something so complex as the brain.
Well, I mean, there's a ton of very smart people out there in academia doing this work and sharing it. And, you know, there's always something new that they're finding out. And and kind of building on the knowledge. And I think also now it makes me feel really old to say, but to like kind of look back across your career and to see how ideas have kind of come and gone or been built. And especially at the moment, because there's a lot of new technology, there's a lot of scientists have decided to cooperate, and they're like sharing data and sharing, sort of these biobanks. And now we've kind of got the emergence of AI and machine learning within the research space, which is then allowing for this really powerful analysis of the data to be done, that's starting to reveal all of these amazing things about the brain. And also we can ask questions that we couldn't necessarily ask before, because we couldn't answer them with one kind of person in a lab calculating things on an Excel spreadsheet. So it continues to be very exciting.
I love that. And so let's talk a little bit about menopause. And I know you've done a book on motherhood and the brain, but getting a little bit older, us women in Gen X who are approaching menopause, got the brain fog, forgetting things, wondering if we've got early onset dementia. There's all this stuff happening to us. What's going on, Sarah? Can you help us? Yeah.
I think, first of all, what's really interesting is a lot of women going through perimenopause, which is, when the hormone sort of starts going up and down in the years before your final period, which is classified as menopause. Lots of women do start to experience a whole range of symptoms. And it seems right now there's like hundreds of them, right? Yeah. The brain fog forgetfulness thing is super important to understand, because when we bring all these women into the research lab and do all the battery of cognitive testing and test memory and attention and reaction speed, etc., we're not really seeing a significant cognitive decline in these women, which is really, really good news. We see the same in pregnancy women or early motherhood women who are saying, I've got baby brain, I'm really forgetful. Let's bring them into the research lab, and we're not picking up cognitive decline. Excellent news. We would not want to be picking up cognitive decline, because then we would really be worrying about, do women, when they experience pregnancy or any kind of next phase of life, become slightly demented? That's not the case. So there are these subjective experiences of feeling fuzzy or foggy, but they're not necessarily we're not necessarily seeing these kind of neurological markers that we would see in someone with Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And I can't tell you how good that news is, both for pregnancy and for perimenopause. Some women get a bit disappointed when I tell them that. It's like, it's good. We don't want cognitive decline. Good news. So what's kind of going on? There's a whole lot going on. We all know that there's a lot going on. I think the simplest way to describe what we know about what is happening to our brains is to think about what menopause actually is from a kind of a physiological and neurological perspective. So we know that menopause, and it seems to be shifting later. There's data coming out recently that actually lots of women are still having their periods up until their mid-50s. So it used to be 50 on average, but we're starting to see a bit of a shift in some Western countries to a little bit later, and that appears to be tied with overall better health and well-being, education, higher socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
What's underlying that, we don't know, but that's kind of, again, not bad news. Well, it depends kind of what your perspective is on periods, right? So what happens is that basically eggs get old and they run out. And all through your kind of reproductive life, from puberty through to now, your ovaries and your brain have been having this lovely cyclical conversation every month. For most women, it's pretty rhythmic, pretty predictable, except when you're pregnant or perhaps if you have been taking hormonal contraceptives. But what happens when your ovaries get old and the eggs sort of stop being released is that conversation sort of starts to falter a bit. And the messages from the ovaries up to the brain may not be heard one month. They may be very kind of quiet, and the brain goes, what did you say? This is a metaphor. The brain's going, what did you say, to the ovaries, and the ovaries are going, sorry, we'll release a bit more estrogen. So the next month the estrogen goes way up, and then the brain's going, not that much. And so what we tend to see with that type of physiological feedback loop is we see these kind of ups, quite significant fluctuations of hormones. And that is having an impact on the brain. And what is happening in the brain is responsible for a lot of the sort of felt symptoms that women have. Not necessarily every symptom, but a lot. Particularly we understand physiologically what's happening when women have hot flashes or issues with thermoregulation.
Yeah.
Flap my shirt here as a way of describing that. So deep inside our brain is a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, and it's very busy, and it's constantly receiving information from our body about things like, your pH or your heart rate or your hormone levels. So it's receiving the information from your ovaries, and it also monitors body temperature. And the estrogen kind of plays a role in sort of setting this little thermostat in our hypothalamus, and it's kind of got a set top point and a bottom point. And what happens is most of your pre-menopausal life, when you get too hot, you behave in ways to cool yourself down, and you get hot, you sweat, you try and release heat, and you take your clothes off. What happens during perimenopause in some women is that kind of top level goes down a bit. And so your body temperature only needs to rise just a tiny, tiny little bit for it to kind of go above that top set point. And your brain's going, gosh, it's hot in here, and sort of sends off this kind of almost alert to your body saying it's just got really, really, really hot, even if your body's kind of cycling within that standard temperature.
Right. So it's like your tolerance goes down.
It's almost like panic stations.
Yeah.
And so your body then tries frantically to cool you down as quick as possible, which is where the hot flash comes, because it's trying to release body heat, even if you're not necessarily super hot, but your body temperature just went up slightly. So you get that kind of very, very powerful physiological response. And then, of course, the behavioral response that goes with that, which is to try and take your clothes off and cool yourself down. And then sitting alongside that, of course, is the meaning that you are making in your mind about that response. Some women find it very, very distressing, very, very stressful, depending on where they are and the context that they're in. Other women are like, oh gosh, whatever, I'm just a bit hot.
Yes.
So there's the different components. There's the physiological component, the kind of behavioral component, and then almost the psychological and emotional component of that. And the same kind of happens for getting cooler, but that does appear to vary a lot more. Some women become more sensitive to the cold, others don't so much. Now we know that that's regulated by estrogen, because if you put estrogen back in using hormone therapies, whether it's the contraceptive pill in perimenopausal woman or MHT and postmenopausal woman, then it usually regulates itself, and it becomes, the brain doesn't go into this blind panic that it does when your temperature rises a little bit. So that's kind of the neurophysiology of the hot flashes. What about some of the other symptoms? Well, one thing that's important to realize is that sleep and body temperature are like intimately entwined. And people are usually quite familiar with the idea that when the sun goes down and it gets dark, melatonin is released from our brain, and melatonin tells our body to get ready to go to sleep. It's not a sleeping tablet in our brain or a sleeping medicine. It essentially gets us physiologically in a state to fall asleep. And one of those things that it does to help us fall asleep is to, again, heat loss. So as our body temperature cools down, we tend to fall asleep. That's why when it's really hot, it's harder to cool down and it's harder to fall asleep. Or when you're really, really cold, it's harder to fall asleep, because what you actually want is the drop in temperature. So we kind of have an intuitive understanding of body temperature and sleep. Now, when you're perimenopausal and you've got thermoregulation issues, you're probably going to have sleep issues. Even if you're not waking up, even if your brain isn't going, panic stations, it's hot in here, and jolting you awake from sleep to try and cool you down, your sleep architecture, so that kind of pattern of deep sleep, light sleep through the night becomes disrupted. And that means you just don't feel as good the next day. Yeah. And if you haven't had a good night's sleep, well, what's the inevitable consequences of that? You kind of feel fuzzy, you feel foggy, you're less emotionally regulated.
You crave sugar.
It happens for a week, happens for a month, happens for a year. So many of the symptoms that women experience, we could in part perhaps tie back sleep disruption. Even if women aren't waking up, sleep architecture might be disrupted. So that's kind of one sort of physiological scenario that we kind of understand from the perspective of the brain. And there's some other things I can get into as well. Don't know how much time we've got.
Well, is there maybe one other thing that you could share on that? Would be great.
Yeah. So we've only just sort of passed the 2-year anniversary of the first study that was published looking to see what happens to women's brains as they go through kind of peri-menopause, post-menopause, and that was published by Lisa Mosconi, who is a researcher in the US who kind of took lots of MRI images of what happens to the structure of women's brains kind of across that time, and actually compared them to men's brains through over the same period of time. So they could see what of this is kind of due to chronological age, and what of this is due to kind of endocrinological changes. What are the changes we'd see in our neurobiology if we did not have a change in hormones? And what they do see are some really interesting changes in terms of grey matter, which is kind of the wrinkly outer cortex of the brain, actually gets a bit fatter. It actually kind of grows slightly. So, it's not all, dismay and despair. It's not all wastage and, dysfunction and decline. Actually, the grey matter kind of plumps up a bit, which is good news.
Bigger.
We don't quite know why and what that means. Perhaps it's the downloading of wisdom. Perhaps it's, matriarchal cortical development. Who knows? We don't quite know.
That's great.
It's good news. Who knew there was good news? But there is. What she said, there's a lot of changes that have been mapped in brains of women through this time. And what we see is perimenopause is kind of a time of change. It's almost like adolescence. It's this kind of phase of change, and then everything kind of levels out. Kind of after the menopause, it's like the brain then kind of adjusts and adapts, because that's what brains do. They retain plasticity. They retain their ability to, when they're healthy, to adapt and respond to kind of changing circumstances, including our changing hormonal circumstances. And then they kind of settle down again. There are some changes in terms of glucose metabolism, which is also reflected in an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes after menopause. But in terms of how the brain kind of metabolizes glucose, it becomes a little less efficient. But there are compensatory mechanisms in place in terms of neuronal metabolism to kind of account for that.
Okay.
And it may be that those kind of adjustments that are taking place metabolically in the brain during that time, maybe they might account for some of the kind of almost cognitive fatigue that some women may experience, or that kind of what we might call colloquially brain fog. But the good news is we're not seeing cognitive decline during that time. We're actually kind of seeing pretty stable levels of cognition through that phase of life.
So it's
there's a bit of kind of menopausal good news story.
Yeah, so like a perceived cognitive decline, but not an actual. People might think that they've got all these things going on, but there's no evidence of serious lasting.
No. I mean, if we look at populations of women, no. I mean, there might be some women, but maybe that doesn't appear to be related to the menopause. And it's a bit like baby brain. We're bringing women into the research lab who say, I'm forgetful, I'm fuzzy, I'm foggy. We go, there's nothing wrong with you cognitively. Neurologically, you are intact and healthy. What women in pregnancy and motherhood are doing is using the word baby brain to describe there is a lot going on. Yeah. I'm just kind of on this steep learning curve. I can't cope. And they've almost been primed, with this gender stereotype their whole lives, that when you've got a brain and it's a female brain, you add some hormones in or take some hormones out, that automatically equals cognitive dysfunction and emotional instability. So women are going in pregnancy and motherhood at least, oh, well, it's my brain that's at fault, when actually it's probably a social support issue. I'm not saying the same thing is happening in menopause, because we are seeing perhaps reasons as to why some women might be experiencing fogginess and fuzziness, but it's probably more likely related to sleep disturbance.
Yeah.
Perhaps this adjustment of the brain during this point in time. So I think it's quite reassuring to know it's not the first signs of Alzheimer's and dementia. It's absolutely not. It might feel that way, but I mean, there's a lot coming at you at this phase of life as well, an awful lot coming at you. And now there's like a whole lot more news about menopause coming at you too, that you've kind of got to make meaning of in terms of, what's happening in your own body and your perceptions of self.
Yeah. And interesting, as you're talking about pregnancy, I'm thinking about the lack of sleep during pregnancy, and perhaps even a greater ancient biological driver of needing to look after the children. I mean, I'm just speculating here, but let's put all the resources into that and not allow you to multitask on 100 other things. But of course, as you said, there are 100 other things going on anyway, just with a baby or just with going through menopause.
And memory, what we remember depends on our attention. So what information we take in and what we filter out. And you're a new mum, you've got like a whole new human who you have to look after, and your brain has been primed to focus solely in on that new little baby and reading their social cues. So it's hardly surprising you're not going to remember the things that you don't pay attention to. And I think midlife women are also going through, an awful lot. I've got teenagers, I've got aging parents. Me and my husband have aging parents in 3 different countries in the world.
Wow.
That we now have to kind of look at, kind of support and look after, and then kind of try and raise teenage boys going through, one of them's doing HSC. There's a lot going on. We're running businesses. We're at the peaks of our careers. You're trying to stay fit. You're trying to stay healthy. You're trying to have a happy marriage. And we're being constantly bombarded. And I think that this is an incredibly important thing that a lot of us don't realize is what happened in the rest of the world. The stressful events that happen all around the world never used to be like smack bang in the middle of our faces from the moment we woke up in the morning.
We didn't hear
our brains are just getting a live stream feed of disaster and war and terror and everyone else's opinion. It's a massive data stream, and the brain is constantly being fed and having to make meaning of alongside just everything else that is going on. And our brain just, tries to make meaning of all sources of information about what is threatening and what should I be doing and thinking and feeling about, not just the hormone status of my body and my kids going through school, my aging parents, but we're expected to have an impassioned opinion about every global event and feel deeply and meaningfully about it. And it's just too much. It's too much.
I'm so glad you said that, Sarah. It's such an important point, and I think people probably don't even think about that.
Yeah. It's we didn't evolve to know what was happening outside of our actual, ability to see what we can see around us, including the people we live with and the rising and setting of the sun, our immediate environment, what we can hear and what we can, and if it's close enough to us, what we can feel and taste and smell. That's how our brains evolved, basically move us through our immediate environment and interact with that, not the data that we're receiving streaming in live from other lands, which of course is important, but I don't think that we realize how incredibly stressful that is, because we're expecting ourselves to also make meaning of that. And if you ignore it, you feel like guilty or something. I don't know.
Or left out or not.
Yeah. And, there's a lot of opinions out there about everything.
And who needs those? We've got to have our own opinions.
Yeah.
So then what are a couple of things that women at this midlife stage can do to improve their brain health?
I think if perimenopausal symptoms are distressing, and there's a big conversation at the moment about the language we should use around this, and I think it's important that the meaning we make of the experiences we have, including in our bodies, are really important. And what may be incredibly distressing to one person might be someone else might not even worry about. So I think understanding that your experiences are the meaning that you're making of what is happening, and if you're distressed, you need help. But if something isn't distressing, you're not kind of missing. I kind of feel like women are being bombarded with information about menopausal symptoms as this kind of, and it was. And I quote from very, very old literature about menopause being a galloping catastrophe. And I don't mean that in any kind of belittling way, but we are constantly being bombarded with information about this as well. And I think also we need to think about the meanings we're making of the information we're receiving. And then when you've kind of done that, like I think if you've got to around 50-ish, you haven't got a good, open relationship with a medical health professional in which you can have a good conversation with, talk through risks, benefits. Do you want to go on hormone therapy? Do you not want to? Can you kind of discuss those options openly with someone, and if the relationship isn't working for you, move on and find someone else. I know that doesn't always work. You live rural, remote, whatever. But I do think it's kind of a time in life when it's useful to develop a relationship with a health professional you can trust and have a good conversation with.
Very good.
So there's that kind of meaning making of this phase of life. I think the second thing is, and it doesn't matter what age you are, whether you're 80 or whether you're 8 or 8 months old, is sleep is the kind of foundational bedrock of good health.
Yeah.
And we're just starting to understand sort of neurologically why we need to sleep, and the brain is kind of flushed out of all the metabolites that it's built up during the day. It's kind of cleansed when we are deeply asleep, and it's also when our memories are consolidated. Sleep's almost the price we pay for brain plasticity, and it's so important to understand kind of not just the basics of sleep hygiene, have a nice cool room, relax, wind down, don't look at your phone, but kind of understand how intimately entwined our circadian rhythms are with the world around us, with the rising and setting of the sun, and how fundamental that is to the health of every cell in our body. And if you can get your sleep kind of reasonably well managed, whether that be taking a kind of a psychological approach or a physiological approach, I think it's almost more important than anything, because everything else, the dominoes won't fall over as easy. And everything else will be easier to build on. It is harder to regulate yourself emotionally. It is harder to deal with anxiety and depression. It is harder to take care of your kids. It is harder to do your job. Everything is harder without good sleep. So there's that. And then I think the other thing is then, social sort of support networks and stuff, like our brains evolved to connect with other people who we can see face to face and touch and smell, and if you want to taste them, so you can, but large parts of our brain are devoted to reading the social cues from other people. And I think it's a bit much sometimes to ask everyone to have like this rich social life when there's a lot going on, but just to understand how important social connection is. We all knew what it was like during COVID when we were all stuck at home and couldn't talk to anyone else except our immediate families, how that isolation was just so stressful in itself. But it's a kind of a time to kind of build those social networks and understand how important or how damaging perhaps loneliness can be, and how important social connections are for brain health.
Yeah, it's such a good point, and it doesn't have to be difficult to connect. I mean, I've started going to the gym again after a bit of a hiatus, but I go with a friend, and that's our chance to catch up and work out together. And there are definitely lots of different ways that are fun to connect with people that become a chore of trying to find 5 hours for your 3 closest friends every week.
Exactly. And you don't, there's a bit of pressure, to go out and have a few drinks and a laugh, whatever. I've joined a community theatre group. A couple of years we put on a musical. We're doing We Will Rock You this year, the Queen tribute. I can't sing, I can't dance, I'm just here for the vibes. I sort of shuffle around in the back row of the ensemble with all the other mums of the suburb, and it's just hilarious to kind of be part of a group of people with this kind of collective purpose. There's some incredibly talented people. I just like kind of being part of something and part of creating something together with people, especially because I work, I run my own business from home. I haven't got workmates. My husband's great. My dog was great, but he died a couple of weeks ago. So it's actually lonely without him too. I don't think we should ever underestimate our little doggy friends.
Absolutely. I've recently joined an amateur orchestra and I love it.
Oh, brilliant. Same thing.
Yeah.
So much fun. That kind of collective effervescence is so important, so important.
Speaking the same language, on the same page, having fun, and it's not a big onerous commitment. You don't have to go night clubbing and stay up all night or drink or that stuff. It's another way of connecting. I think we've lost the sense of fun actually because we're busy doing so many things. Yeah.
I agree. And I think especially if you get to this point in your life and you've got, your kids aren't, you're probably not wiping little bottoms anymore, having to volunteer for the primary school cake stall. You can kind of, do something fun.
Where's the purpose? Yeah, exactly. And so just to wrap up today, Sarah, can you tell us about your books if people who are going through perimenopause, menopause, postmenopause are interested in learning more about their brains and what they can do? Or if there are people who are in HR roles listening to this, or who are in a coaching role, and what sorts of options they have for working with you in that capacity?
Yeah, sure. Well, the girls are back there, the two sisters, I call them. I've written 2 books on women's brain health. So this one's more about the neurobiology of pregnancy and motherhood and how it sculpts our brains and changes our minds for the better. It's very shiny and pink, as you can see. So it's a bit of a tribute as well. I call them the women of steel, to the kind of the Gen X neuroscientists out there who are kind of leading the charge in terms of recognizing 0.5% of all neuroscience research is being done looking at women's health issues.
Wow.
And a lot of them feature in this book. It is about pregnancy and motherhood, but it's also about sort of the gender stereotypes we've absorbed and the messages we carry, and kind of looks throughout the lifespan. And my first book, which I'm considering doing an update for because it kind of came out 2018, I say as a womb to tomb. There's a whole chapter in here on menopause and brain health. But thanks to the women of steel who are doing all of the good work in the neurosciences, there are so many new updates that are coming out all of the time within this menopause space. So this just kind of touches on the research of where it was sort of 5 years ago. But I do try and provide as many updates as I can kind of through my other social media channels, so at my Instagram, LinkedIn, and also my blog. Whenever anything new comes out, and there's a lot of new stuff coming out, I'm providing updates to the info that's in this book here. And
I love that that's a whole of life book, because it's great to think about one stage of life, but the context is, what did I do?
Absolutely. You can't look at kind of any point in the lifespan without looking at what came. So it starts in utero. It starts when the sperm meets the egg and goes through till Jean Calment, who was aged 123. So I cover a lot. And then, I teach a number of continuing professional development programs in applied neuroscience and brain health. So I have sort of 3 of the courses teach the identical curriculum in different formats as a self-study. There's a 2-week kind of live sprint version that's all taught online, and then it's sort of a slower paced 12-week version. So they're the Brain Coach Bootcamp and Neuroscience Academy. So they teach, that's a great introduction to neuroscience that's relevant to people's lives. I teach a course in women's brain health called In Her Head, which is a 5-day course, kind of, again, taking that womb to tomb perspective, looking at the literature and having a lot of really great, open, wise conversations with all these amazing women who join about how we can integrate that work into their professional lives. And then I also teach the next course, which commences in Feb 2024, is called the Neuroscience Coaching Network, or the NCN it goes by, and I teach that in partnership with Dr. Mary Collins, who is she has a PhD in coaching psychology. She works at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, used to work in HR at Deloitte in Ireland, and is into sort of leadership, and is writing a book on emotional intelligence for dentists at the moment, because she works with surgeons and dentists. And we teach that, and that's sort of in 3 parts. So there's how can you take the neuroscience that we've learned in my prior courses and integrate that into coaching practice? So we take a look at different aspects of coaching, like self-awareness, the coaching relationship, goals and motivation, etc., and kind of look at how neuroscience can inform coaching practice within each of those kind of areas. And then we put everyone into triads, so into groups of 3, usually geographical, but it kind of depends because we have a global studentship. We usually have about 80 or 90 people. And then you kind of work together in your triad to come up with a neuroscience informed tool or practice. So we've had everything from coaching cards to talks developed, and just everything that you can imagine, working with mothers, working in HR, working in corporate leadership, people in the prison system, people in the education system, just kind of how can they apply that neuroscience really thoughtfully and develop some kind of tool or new practice. And then we have an invited speakers series. So we've had In the past, we had Andrew Huberman a couple of years ago, who's an old friend of mine from my PhD days. Next year, we have Scott Barry Kaufman, who's going to be talking to us, who's a psychologist, talking about self-actualization. We have an amazing neuroscientist here in Australia called Maureen Irish, who talks about memory and how our past experiences inform our ability to set goals and imagine the future. She talks about that in a neurobiological perspective. We have a researcher from University of Pennsylvania next year who's talking about the neurobiology of worry and stuckness, what happens when someone gets stuck in their head. We have people talking about burnout, emotion regulation, sort of social networks, conversation science, how we can understand conversations from a scientific perspective and use that in our coaching. So it's quite a remarkable speaker series that we have. I'm really proud of how we've curated that. And everyone just has a good old time as well. It's great fun. She's Irish, she loves a good laugh, so do I. So we try and have a bit of fun as well as the kind of the collaboration and community.
That sounds amazing, and I think I know where my next year's CPD will be coming from.
Excellent. We offer 40 hours of CPD, and it's accredited. All the programs are accredited by the ICF for CPD hours. So
that's so great, Sarah. Thank you so much for your time today. We've covered a whole bunch of things related to the brain, but it's so interesting, and I think you made some really important points. And what I take away is we're not crazy. And we're not becoming demented.
No, we're not.
There are things that we can do to improve our brain health, and there's study that we can do to learn about our brains. But I think one of the really big things that came out for me is stop trying to do 10,000 things. We're not meant to be doing 10,000 things. And if we simplify our lives and we take it a bit easier on ourselves and don't tell ourselves a story of what we should be doing, probably it's going to take some of the pressure off and we'll be just fine and healthy.
Yep, absolutely. You've got it. I clearly explained the brain well.
Thanks again, Sarah. Appreciate your time.
You're so welcome.